Welcome. This is Time Traveling Ruben, the People's Time Traveler. Come with me on a journey to explore the past, to view how it has shaped the present, how and why it is sanitized for many, and what lessons it has to offer in order to make a better future for all. While true history is under attack, don't forget to counter their attack by pressing the subscribe button on my Time Traveling Ruben page in order to receive more videos and more information that I'll be throwing out in the future in order to shed light about the struggles and tribulations of the marginalized, the oppressed, and a lot of forgotten and hidden history, both in the United States and throughout the world. This next episode was recorded during Thanksgiving Day 2022. And what is Thanksgiving Day? Thanksgiving is a holiday celebrated by millions of people every November here in the United States of America. And they celebrate it by having gatherings, by having feasts with their families, in celebration of what they're thankful for in regards to their lives. However, for some people, it is not a day of Thanksgiving. It is definitely not a day to be grateful for anything. In fact, for some people, it is a day of mourning, in particular for indigenous people in Massachusetts, who are directly tied to the story of Thanksgiving. It has been a day of mourning for them. It has been recognized as such ever since the 1970s. And what exactly are these people mourning in comparison to other people who are grateful today for being alive? Even though some other people who do celebrate this holiday are in fact stuck at work, away from their families, even though it is nationally recognized as a day of gathering with the family, being thankful for what you have for. And that is another story yet connected to this issue as well. However, going back to indigenous people, in Massachusetts in particular, what exactly are they mourning? They are in fact mourning one of the worst, if not the worst, genocide in world history. This genocide began in 1492 with Christopher Columbus sailing to the west from Spain with the backing and funding of Queen Isabella. Both of them wanted to find new ways to tap the trade routes and the commerce in Asia and in modern-day India. However, they thought it was a faster way to cross the Atlantic Ocean from Europe by sailing to the west across the Atlantic Ocean, as opposed to sailing to the east, as other European powers had at the moment. However, in the process of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, Christopher Columbus landed in an entirely new world, from their point of view, from his point of view at least. However, this new world was already inhabited by over 60 million people who had their own cultures, their own civilizations, their own forms of farming, their own forms of trade, and even their own forms of conducting warfare amongst each other. An entire landmass, which today is known as two continents between North and South America, full of people. However, Christopher Columbus never actually reached the mainland of these landmasses. He initially landed on the island of San Salvador in modern-day Bahamas. And in the process, he encountered the Arawak and Taino indigenous people who lived there for thousands of years peacefully. Christopher Columbus, however, took advantage of this peacefulness that was central to their culture. And he began enslaving the indigenous people. He began exploiting them. For example, he actually forced indigenous people to look for gold so that he could enrich himself and enrich the crown in Spain. One particular disciplinary atrocity that Christopher Columbus and his men carried out while enslaving the indigenous population was forcing people, including children, to look for gold. And if they did not find gold, or the amount of gold that Christopher Columbus and his men requested at a certain moment, essentially if they returned with empty hands, they would have the arms chopped off. Which, by the way, became a similar brutal practice that King Leopold would carry out many centuries later while Belgium colonized the Congo. However, Christopher Columbus is merely the beginning of this story. While he colonized what is now known as the West Indies and the Caribbean. He merely started an entire process, which would essentially and effectively kill millions of people in what is now known as North and South America. As Christopher Columbus had finished his voyages of exploitation, plunder, rape, and mass murder, word began to spread across Europe of this so-called New World from their perspective, and the potential opportunities it had provided to them. As a result, Christopher Columbus had started off an entire chain of conquest, a competition over this newly discovered world, for the sake of greed, power, and essentially hubris. Christopher Columbus had set off an entire chain where European powers began to carve out their empires in the New World. For instance, the French and the British began to colonize what is now known as North America. The Spanish began to colonize what is now known as Latin America along with the Portuguese. Essentially, the empires began to carve out indigenous land, conquer it, and in the process creating the worst ethnic cleansing in world history by pushing indigenous people off their lands, by waging wars against them, by pitting them against each other, but also by spreading inadvertently and on purpose diseases which were foreign to these indigenous people, whether they were smallpox, well, the deadliest disease in world history, whether it was cholera, or other diseases which the indigenous people had no immunity against, and in the process killing millions of the original inhabitants of this Western Hemisphere. From the perspective of Europeans and the colonizers who came here to what is now North and South America, the original inhabitants of this land were seen as inferior or primitive, but that is far from the truth. In fact, here in the eastern United States, the indigenous people who lived here, the Lenape among others, had a sophisticated agricultural system, a system of creating food, which was a lot more advanced than the ones that were created in Europe. While Europe underwent many famines and other forms of food scarcity problems. And also, in regards to civilization, it is common for Europeans and their ancestors to see indigenous people as primitive or uncivilized, but that is far from reality. In fact, in Latin America, there was no greater civilizations that existed on the earth. During the 1500s, in the earlier stage of colonization, for instance, for many hundreds of years, in Mesoamerica, civilizations such as the Mayan Empire and the Aztec Empire existed, with their great pyramids and great cities such as Tenochtitlan, which in fact rivaled, if not surpassed, magnitudes greater than European cities such as Paris and London. Today, if you visit such places where the empires existed, such as Mexico and Guatemala, you will see the remnants of those great empires, such as the step pyramids, among other structures. Not to mention the culture that still exists as a result of those empires. The empires in Mesoamerica were so advanced compared to European empires that they were sophisticated in such disciplines such as astronomy, geometry, among other forms of science and mathematics. Therefore, they were far from primitive. They were very advanced and in many ways comparable to the empires of Europe. However, they were not without their flaws, considering that they were empires, and as any other empire throughout history, whether European, indigenous, or otherwise, they were just as exploitative and murderous. However, the fact is, indigenous people overall were not primitive at all. They were very advanced. In fact, both continents, both North and South, as I stated before, had an entire international system of different cultures, of different forms of trade, different forms of agriculture. They had astronomy, they had medicine, they had different forms of science and art, etc. Very similar to Europe, and also they fought wars against each other for conquest and rivalry. And another great civilization, indigenous civilization that existed in Latin America was also the Inca Empire. Um, Very similar to the other great civilizations in Europe as well. You had a centralized government. Only one difference though, they didn't have money. I mean, which is a very interesting thing, how they operated an entire complex society without money. But they had the same problems and the same ambitions as European empires, albeit at a smaller scale. I mean, they were an empire conquering neighboring nations and cultures, incorporating them in their empire. And in the process, they also fought wars amongst each other until at the very end, they fought wars against the invading Spanish Empire, which essentially annihilated the existence of this empire, and the rest is history. The bottom line is, during this worst ethnic cleansing and genocide in world history, a lot was lost. It wasn't just, primitive backwards people from the perspective of Europeans that were being, colonized for their own good, to introduce them to Christianity, and because the European way was superior. No, the fact is, this was an ethnic cleansing for its own sake, for European hegemony, for European power and domination over other people for its own purposes, for greed, effectively for power and greed and money, and to feel superior. Um, so this was the early stage of colonization around the 1500s and 1600s. Um, like I said, millions of people die in that process that originally lived here for thousands of years, and the one landmass, or what is now known as North and South America. Millions of nations were displaced. I mean, many nations were displaced. Millions of people were displaced and killed, both through guns, European military power. From the Spanish, the British, and the French, and the Dutch, etc. Both deliberately by the gun, by the sword, but also by bringing diseases from Europe, which were completely alien to the people who lived here for thousands of years. And that process, we're talking about somewhere between 80 and 90% of the indigenous population of both continents, both North and South, were killed off in this process, which effectively makes it the worst genocide in history, which we're talking about 80 to 60% of approximately 60 million people, or somewhere between 60 to 100 million people that lived in both continents. And the mass murder and genocide was so horrible and so impactful that during the time period, this mass dying actually created a global cooling. It is now known through scientific study that the planet actually cooled off as a result of this mass dying in both continents, and as a result of European colonization. That's how horrific it was. That's how horrible it was. And then, fast forward throughout this history, after the 1600s, the 1700s, and then the 1800s, the places where European colonization took place, such as North America and South America and Latin America and the Caribbean, etc., they began to fight wars of independence against, their European colonizers, both indigenous people, and European people who came here, as indigenous, as workers, as regular people, and also, free Africans, etc. They all came together and started fighting wars of independence against the European colonizers, whether it be, the Spanish, the British, or the French, or the Dutch, etc. However, once those places became independent, they continued, essentially the same thing the Europeans were carrying out against indigenous populations. They continued that process of genocide. I mean, one big example of this is the project that became the independent United States of America, and also Canada as well. Um, but in particular, the United States of America, since it's the place I live in and I'm more familiar with. The fact is, once the United States of America became independent from Great Britain or the British Empire, they continued to expand west. Essentially, the United States of America began with 13 colonies on the eastern coast. We know the story. They gained their independence in 1776, but really 1783, after the Treaty of Paris, officially recognized them as an independent nation. The United States of America, though, began to slowly and viciously expand westward across the entire vast land that is North America. Began to expand slowly, bit by bit, and in that process, expulsing, millions of people who lived here, many different nations, indigenous people. And to the point that the survivors of this expulsion, of this ethnic cleansing, really, or ethnic cleansings of many nations, really, the survivors were placed in what is known as reservations, for the most part, in what is now the Western United States, and they still live there. So the United States, like I said, began with the 13 colonies, and they continued to expand. And they justified this, with this ideology called manifest destiny, which basically, made it seem as if it was like their right, their religious right, to expand this nation to the West, to provide it with civilization, because no civilization existed here, according to them, before that. However, in the process, the examples are many throughout U.S. history. The Trail of Tears is one example, and also the so-called Indian Wars in the plains in the 1800s, which, led to the Wounded Knee Massacre in North Dakota in the 1880s. And then, and also the buffalo in the West, many indigenous people depended on buffalo as a form of sustenance. However, in order to crush any resistance and to essentially continue the expulsion of indigenous people from the land, because the United States wanted to exploit the land's resources for, the benefit of the wealthy in this country, the U.S. military, along with, its volunteers, began to kill buffalo in order to starve out indigenous people to submission. It's just one example of what happened while the United States continued to expand to the West and became what it is today, a nation that is bordered by two oceans, the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. And that process of creating that unified nation was a very murderous and genocidal process, which led to the deaths of millions of indigenous people and the expulsions of many that are now relegated to reservations that live in poverty, relative poverty compared to the rest of the nation, And this legacy continues today. Like, this is not something that just happened in the past. It's something that continues today. There's many examples of that, and it continues both ideologically and also it continues today materially as well. Indigenous communities in the United States suffer the largest percentages of poverty, unemployment. They suffer discrimination, at a massive scale. And not to mention that the population is a lot smaller than it was when the United States was first founded. We had, we had tens of millions of people, indigenous people living here of many nations in this North American continent, when the United States was founded. But then now, once the United States has actually completely expanded to the West, the population is a lot smaller than tens of millions. We're talking about like 4 million. So not only not only were they that they suffered a massive genocide and where they pushed off their land in order to create the settler colonial project that is the United States, but they're also the ones who have survived, at least, are relegated to a second class status that still exists today. They're relegated to poverty, disproportional poverty, disproportional unemployment, disproportional police violence, disproportional incarceration, etc. Very similar to the descendants of, African slaves, but arguably even to a worse extent. And it's not talked about as much as descendants of slaves because it is a smaller population overall. And a lot of people assume this is just a thing of the past, but in reality, it still exists today. And like I said, it also exists ideologically, as the case of, just recently the Washington, the football team that represents Washington D.C. It used to be called the Redskins, which essentially was a slur against indigenous people, for various reasons. And thankfully, that the name of that football team has been changed. However, there are many other football teams throughout the country, in high schools and things like that, that are still named Redskins. That's just one example. I mean, the Atlanta Braves, the baseball team, is another example. Essentially, the fans do a tomahawk chop. I'm sure if you watch the baseball games, you'll know about this. The Atlanta Braves, the fans that do a tomahawk chop. And the thing is that the chant they do is not even a real indigenous chant. It's like a mocking, fake indigenous chant. I mean, highly offensive. They've been criticized over and over again. However, it still exists. Like, it has not changed because people, money rules everything. It's what people like, and they don't want to change. They're scared to change tradition. And in the process, they don't care if it's offensive to indigenous people and affects them in any way, psychologically. Which is, in fact, a continuation of this colonization that began, in 1776, if not 1492, with Columbus landing in San Salvador in the Bahamas. Otherwise, yeah, it continues today in many forms. That's just one way, ideologically. It also continues today materially. Like I said, despite, aside from the disproportional poverty that indigenous communities in the United States experience and the violence that they experience through police and, white supremacists, etc., they also experience, continued policies of trying to remove them from their land and also contaminate their lands. One example of this was actually recently in 2016 with Standing Rock, where this company wanted to create a pipeline running right through the land in North Dakota, in the Lakota Nation that lived in a reservation in North Dakota called Standing Rock. And like I said, this energy company, wanted to create a pipeline through the land, and basically the indigenous people did not want that in the land because not only did it, would affect them health-wise if there is some kind of like oil rupture or some kind of explosion resulting from this fossil fuel pipeline. It also was planned to run through a sacred area, a burial ground, essentially, that was sacred to them. And as a result, so that was an issue. But in addition, it was also part of a larger protest of protecting the planet, that is undergoing climate change as a result of these policies. There was a big uprising, and a lot of brutality, against indigenous protests took place, such as police beating them, using dogs against them, things like that. To the extent that one night, in 2016, a cold night, they actually, the police came and used a cold water hose in the middle of this freezing December night to, brutalize protesters that were fighting against this pipeline running through indigenous land. And the brutalization was so extreme that actually one of my close friends then almost lost her arm, in a police grenade explosion that the police actually threw at her arm and exploded and literally took off a chunk of her arm. Thankfully she's doing better now, but the police, that's to the extent that, colonization will go to in order to impose itself, in order to continue, the exploitation of indigenous land. Because indigenous people protect the land, but they also protect the resources that are on that land, which are harmful, in particular to indigenous people, but to people throughout the entire world with this ongoing climate crisis. Because the reality is, indigenous people, they exploit, like the genocide that took place against them, is part of the story, is a big part of the story, but it's also tied to a much bigger story, which is the fact that the United States of America today is the second largest, contributor of climate change. And in fact, the worst contributor or the biggest contributor of climate change historically. And it's no coincidence that these fossil fuels that are being extracted come from stolen indigenous land, a land that is still being stolen, that is still being abused, in order to extract these harmful resources, which not only affect indigenous people the most, but also affect people around the world because of climate change, because of the climate crisis. And again, there's so many ways of, how this, this colonization that began in 1492 continues today. Another ideological example is, the U.S. military. Essentially, the U.S. military, you could argue, continues this project that began here in the United States with the expansion westward, throughout the entire world. And it does this, both by force, basically doing the same thing that was done to indigenous people here, throughout the world, as was the case in Vietnam during the 60s and 70s. As was the case of, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan recently, the occupation of those two countries for over 20 years. But also ideologically, it continues that legacy of colonialism. For example, it names a lot of its weapons and units after indigenous people, such as the Apache helicopter, such as the Cherokee, the Comanche helicopters, things of that nature. So names helicopters and other machines of war after the victims of the genocide of the United States, in a weird glorification of the people that resisted against the colonization. Sorry. But also while essentially continuing that spirit of colonization elsewhere around the world. Overall, that while the colonization took place against indigenous people, there are instances of resistance. Standing Rock being one of the examples in 2016. But, going back to the 70s, there was a group called the American Indian Movement, which started in 1968. And they resisted, ferociously and bravely against, this ongoing colonial project of the United States of America by addressing this, disproportional poverty that exists in the indigenous communities, especially in the reservations. And they resisted in many ways. One example of this is, by having a confrontation against, the police and the federal government by occupying the site of the Wounded Knee Massacre that took place in the 19th century by the hands of the United States government. Another example of this, a very good example, was when they occupied Alcatraz in the 1970s in order to show that, this prison is indigenous land. It does not belong to the United States government. It belongs to people who originally lived here. That was the proclamation. And it was a great way to protest. And unfortunately from that struggle, there are political prisoners and many people who lost their lives in that struggle in the 70s. The struggle again for indigenous rights, which was inspired by the struggle for Black liberation, Black freedom, the civil rights movement in the 60s. Actually, a lot of the freedom fighters lost their lives as well, as I said. For example, 64 members of the American Indian Movement were murdered mysteriously during this time period, and they were not investigated. Those murders were not investigated anyway by the FBI or the federal government. The American Indian Movement, was actually under FBI's COINTELPRO surveillance program, which served to destabilize, and pretty much crush by any means necessary, including assassinations, um, far left or movements that were fighting for liberation at that time, whether it was Black liberation, women's liberation, in this case, indigenous liberation, or just or the anti-war movement against who were marching against the Vietnam War at that time. So going back to the American Indian movement, there was another right after the Wounded Knee confrontation that took place in 1973. There was another incident, you would say, and in this incident, there was a shootout during his occupation, which led to the deaths of 2 FBI agents and 1 indigenous person, and then 4 indigenous people were arrested. 3 of them, however, were acquitted of murder. 1 of them was actually acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. However, 1 of the 4 that were arrested was actually convicted and was sentenced to life in prison, despite the fact that there's very little evidence that he was responsible for the killings of the 2 FBI agents. And is now currently serving his 46th year in prison. His name is Leonard Peltier. And people like to say that there's political prisoners in other countries, such as China, Russia, all this so-called authoritarian countries from our perspective. But the reality is the United States has political prisoners as well. And Leonard Peltier is actually one example of that. He's actually one of the longest-serving political prisoners that's still in prison today, 46 years. He proclaims till this day of his innocence, that he was not responsible for killing those 2 people, those 2 FBI agents. And the fact is, he was not given a fair trial. And there's no real evidence. There was actually recanted testimony that he was the one who actually committed those murders. So, again, he's still serving 46 years. And the fact overall is that the reason he's really serving he has been serving 46 years in prison, and he's still in prison in the United States, is because he had the audacity to stand up for indigenous rights, to lead the fight or to be a part of the fight against this continual project of settler colonialism that is now the United States, that actually not only has historically killed many indigenous people and still does today, but relegates them to a second-class status of disproportional poverty and violence. So overall, to sum everything, Thanksgiving Day, yes, enjoy your food and all that stuff, but don't forget what this holiday really represents, and do what you can in order to continue the struggle against the other original sin of the United States of America and the Western Hemisphere. A sin which essentially is the worst genocide in world history.